What's up, guys? Skippy Africanus here, and welcome back to another Cartridge of the Week episode, this week featuring the most powerful handgun cartridge in the world, or at least at one point, the 44 Remington Magnum. Or as you'll also see it called, 44 Magnum or 44 Mag. Honestly, while there's a plethora of different 44 cartridges, if you hear someone bring up a 44, there is no doubt that this is the 44 they are talking about. Now, before we get into the rather neat history and performance of the classic 44 Magnum, we will of course do what we always do and take a look at the headstamp, which on the top we can see W-W Super, standing for the manufacturer of at least the casing, Winchester, and on the bottom we see 44 Magnum, which of course is our caliber, 44 Magnum. Now I mentioned that at least the casing was made by Winchester, because I'm not entirely sure if this is a bullet I pulled from the box to put on my display shelf, or if I had pulled it from my reloaded ammo and just set it there, because 44 Magnum was a caliber that a few years back I was shooting and reloading quite a lot. Now, needless to say, I have narrowed down that this specific example features a 240 grain bullet using, of course, some basic mathematics. Honestly, I don't think it really matters that we know what the weight of this example is for the video's sake, but I was just more so curious. Now, the 44 Magnum has a rather interesting origin story. It came about as a result of Elmer Keith's experimentation with the 44 Special. It should be noted that originally he had been experimenting using the 45 Long Colt. However, after blowing up a revolver, or a few, he decided on basing his experiments off the 44 Special. This cartridge was chosen for a couple of reasons. First off, the casings themselves were a little bit thicker than those of the 45 Long Colt. Secondly, revolver manufacturers producing revolvers chambered in both 45 Long Colt and 44 Special would be using the same size cylinder, with the chambers being bored out for either of the two cartridges, and what this meant was the 44 Special would have a lot more metal between the chambers to allow for higher chamber pressures, which, combining with the earlier mentioned thicker casings, would allow for some fairly high-pressured loadings. Also, another little side benefit, at the time there was plenty more different bullets for the 44 caliber than there were for the 45 caliber. Not as important as the previous two benefits, but still a nice touch all in all. Once loadings were more or less finalized, Keith would go to Smith & Wesson, whom after some back and forth would produce a prototype for what would eventually become the Model 29 revolver. The gun was completed on December 15th of 1955, then later on January 19th of 1956, they would announce the introduction of their new Model 29 with its 44 Magnum chambering, and all for the low price of $140. Now, accounting for inflation, that's around $1,647.09, at least, of course, at the time of this video's recording. Smith & Wesson, however, would not remain the only producers of a gun in this caliber for long, though, as Ruger would very quickly introduce their Ruger Blackhawk in 44 Magnum offering early that same year, which there is plenty of speculation as to how they actually got a revolver in this chambering that early. Anywhere from someone gave them the plans secretly to someone gave them not secretly. It's all very weird, but nonetheless, they would, of course, have their Ruger Super Blackhawk pretty darn close to when the 29 would release. Which I will say, I haven't mentioned the gun that I own in 44 Magnum, but it is one of Ruger's Super Blackhawks, and I gotta say, with all the trigger time I have behind it, I am most certainly a little bit biased towards that 44 in particular. Nevertheless, 44 Magnum chamber guns would quite literally fly off the shelves as soon as they were introduced, and this is thanks largely in part to the overwhelmingly positive reviews that it would receive from its early bird testers. Sure, while much later movies like, Dirty Harry certainly helped in 44 Magnum sales, the truth of the matter is that from the get-go, it was a super popular offering. For the first few years, quite literally not being able to last on store shelves, and having many vendors selling guns in the caliber up to twice their retail value. Of course, the caliber would not stick solely to revolvers, with Ruger being the first to introduce a long arm in 1959 with their Ruger Model 44, which, funny enough, if you don't know what that is, it's not a lever action actually, rather it is a semi-automatic rifle. Of course, lever actions would follow very soon after, with Marlin Reed introducing their 1894 and 44 Magnum. Now, aside from revolvers, semi-autos, and lever actions, many single shots as well as even bolt actions would find themselves in 44 Magnum chambering, and, of course, the semi-automatic pistol wouldn't be left out either, with the classic Desert Eagle also being offered in 44 Magnum chambering. And although the 44 Magnum is no longer considered the most powerful handgun cartridge in the world, having been eclipsed many years ago, it still does in some ways remain perhaps the most popular, at least commonly shot pistol cartridge. I mean, there are plenty more 44 Magnum owners and shooters out there than there are over, say, a 500 Smith & Wesson. And this makes a lot of sense when you consider the versatility of the cartridge. Aside from just range fun, it is also quite the effective hunting round, especially with the previously mentioned versatility of what guns it can be chambered in. You know, just as much as you can be hunting deer with a lever action rifle, you can also be protecting yourself against bear with a more easily carried revolver. And despite being a very potent round, when it comes to recoil, it is fairly manageable. Sure, it's not going to be very light shooting, but compared to, again, the more powerful handgun cartridges, there's a reason that this tends to be the max with a lot of people. Now, speaking of the versatility earlier, it doesn't just stick with guns, as when it comes to cartridge selection, there exists plenty of different loadings for all sorts of applications. Now, as mentioned, what we have here is a 240 grain bullet with this specific cartridge, which is the more popular loading. And while I don't have an exact speed for this specific loading, on average with a 240 grain bullet, you are looking at around 12 to a little over 1400 feet per second. However, there does exist plenty of loadings featuring the lighter 180 grain bullets that tend to fly at around the 1600 feet per second range. And my personal favorite loading in particular, the 300 grain stuff PPU puts out, flies at around 1200 plus feet per second. And I will say, when you shoot a 300 grain round, you know you are shooting a 300 grain round. Now, of course, we could go on and on with the various loadings and the likes, but as mentioned earlier, there is a massive amount of different loadings for the 44 Magnum. Instead, I would like to go off into a little side tangent on the specific name of this cartridge, namely the 44 portion. The 44 Magnum actually features a .429 diameter bullet. The 44 designation is actually a carryover from the 44 Smith & Wesson American, which used what's called a heeled bullet. Essentially, think what a 22LR uses, where the bullet diameter is the same diameter of the outside casing. Now, the 44 Russian, which would use the same case, would do away with that heeled bullet, going with the kind we're much more used to today. However, it would still use the 44 designation despite the smaller bullet, and as a result, the 44 Special, then later 44 Magnum, would also continue to use this 44 designation. Just a neat little fact that I'm sure we'll bring up a few more times in later videos on the previously mentioned cartridges. But anyways, I think that is going to do it for this week's Cartridge Week episode featuring the 44 Remington Magnum. I hope you all enjoyed the video as much as I personally enjoyed making it, and I will see y'all next time.